Okay, here we go. Hello everybody and welcome to the King's Monologue. Have you heard of the word Kemet? Well, if you have or if you haven't, either way, I suggest that you stick around. Today's video is going to be a breakdown of that very controversial word. We know why the word is controversial, but it really shouldn't be. We're going to be unpacking what this word actually means, looking very deeply into the hieroglyphics, breaking down each of the symbols used, what they meant and how they were used. It can tell us essentially so much about their belief system. So, if you've been keeping up to date with the King's Monologue and you've watched any of my latest videos, then you should know a little bit at least about the ancient Egyptian lexicon and how essentially it's contributed so much to our modern language. It is very much the basis of our modern alphabet. However, this video is not about the alphabet in general, and it's not about the ancient Egyptian language in general. It's specifically about this one word which they use to not only describe their land, but they use to describe themselves. So some of you at this point might be asking a very logical question: what is Kemet and why is it important? And actually there are some implications in terms of the way we view Egypt and even view our modern world as a result of translating this word correctly. Now, most of you will be familiar with the term Egypt. However, the name Egypt is not the one that the ancient Egyptians gave to themselves.
The modern nomenclature of African nations was almost wholly imposed by Europe after the 1884 Berlin Conference. The name Egypt itself was reserved for the region of Northeast Africa, which has been known by many names such as Kemet, Mizraim and Misa previously. The name Egypt is believed to have come from the native name Het Ka-Ptah or Het Kip-Ptah, which roughly translates to House of the Spirit of Ptah, and referred to a temple in the ancient capital city of Memphis in Lower Egypt. Now, importantly, Memphis, or Men Nefer as it was indigenously referred to, was the first district of Lower Egypt, which is significant. When the name was adopted by the Greeks, which they characteristically bastardized into their own tongue, changing Het Kip-Ptah to Egyptos, they were using this name to refer to the northern or lower part of the region, which included the delta. Often references to Egyptos denoted the region between the Mediterranean and Men Nefer. As we well know, since then, multiple foreign invasions eventually led to the complete annexation of the land under various invaders, expanding the boundaries to eventually encapsulate both the lower and upper regions of Kemet.
So the modern borders that we have were drawn up during the Berlin Conference, as we know, and they reflect all of Egypt, or Egypt in its entirety, right down to the first cataract. Great. So now that that's out of the way, let's dive into some hieroglyphics. Let's look at the word Kemet. Kemet essentially is formed from 4 hieroglyphics. We have 1 ideogram, 2 phonemes or phonetics, and a single determinative. Now, I'm going to give you a very brief overview of what all of that means, but if you want a more in-depth overview, I suggest you have a look at this video.
These are literal pictures of things known as logograms. These symbols serve the function of being language agnostic, in that as long as the person is familiar with the object's form, they should be able to understand the meaning regardless of the language they speak. Examples of pictograms in the ancient Egyptian language are hen representing an infant, remet representing a man, or sir, a giraffe. Ideograms are similar to logograms in that animate and inanimate objects were used. However, in this case they were used to represent concepts. This allowed the Kemites to greatly increase the capabilities of their lexicon and access more abstract concepts. An example of ideographic symbolism is found in the Ankh symbol, which was used to convey the concept of life, or the Nefer symbol representing beauty. All determinatives were either logographic or ideographic. Finally, there are phonetics or phonemes. Egyptologists boiled the Kemetic abjad down to 24 consonantal phonemes, according to Adele. Examples of these alphabetic phonemes are this squiggly line for N and this loaf symbolizing T. However, there are a myriad of phonetic symbols combining letters that give both single and multisyllabic sounds, such as this symbol for ka and this symbol for mu. Now, briefly revisiting the use of determinatives in the Kemetic language, these were used likely due to the homophonic nature of the Kemetic language in that the same word could have multiple meanings. The use of determinatives provided context to the symbols being used, such as this symbol determining that this word refers to the name of a god. Thus, determinatives will play a key role in understanding how to interpret the phrase Kemet in this discussion.
So to break that down, you had pictographics, you had ideographics or ideograms, you had phonemes or phonetics, and then finally you had determinatives, which play a really important role. Let's use a little bit of that knowledge to break this down. The first symbol that we have here is the end of a piece of charcoal that has been charred. Now, there has been a little bit of discussion about whether or not this is the spiny back of a crocodile. This symbol here, cam, represents the color black, or at least represents definitely the color tone or the color group black for the ancient Kemetic people.
Unlike modern societies, ancient peoples did not deal in individual color tones as much as they dealt with color groups and color families. For most of our known history, blue, for instance, was part of the black color group. Research suggests that the major color groups of the ancient world were, by and large, the same for most societies, these color groups being black, white, red, and sometimes yellow and green, but interestingly, never blue. British researcher William Gladstone discovered that the color blue was not distinguished independently in the ancient world. This is brilliantly explained by this informative excerpt from the Y Files.
Much of modern literature is, in some ways, derivative of Homer. So Gladstone wondered if Homer was colorblind and saw blue as maybe something else. So he went through thousands of pages of Homer's writing and counted his references to color. Black is mentioned almost 200 times, white about 100 times, red is mentioned 13 times, yellow and green fewer than 10 times, but blue? 0. So Gladstone looked through other ancient Greek writing. Nothing was ever described as being blue. The Quran, the Hebrew Bible, ancient Chinese, Hindu, Icelandic, no blue, not once. These ancient texts reference colors with pretty much the same proportion as Homer's epics. And human eyes are the same now as they were back then, so why couldn't they see blue?
So even though the ancient Egyptians were the first to successfully isolate blue pigment, which they called irtu, and we know as Egyptian blue, the color itself continued to be used within the context of simply being an expression of black. This is demonstrated by the illustrations of deities who were certainly described as black, deities such as Ausar, Heru, Amin Ra, Khnum, and Min. But these same deities were often depicted using either black or differing compounds of blue and even green pigment. The indigo plant, a deep blue-green plant, was considered black, as were both the day and night sky.
The ocean wasn't blue, it was a shade of green. The sky wasn't blue, it was light black. Blue finally emerges as its own color when the Egyptians invented a way to produce a blue dye. So unless you have a word to describe a color, it becomes really difficult for humans to perceive it. And there's proof of this, even today.
This ancient color interpretation still exists even up to very recent times amongst Nilotic populations of Africa. In a 2006 paper titled Color Categories and Category Acquisition in Himba and English, researcher Debbie Robertson conducted controlled studies amongst English and Himba populations. She observed,
in the case of navy blue, which lies perceptually between English blue and black, for English speakers, this is in the same category as focal blue. For Himba speakers, however, it is in the same category as black.
Understanding this differentiated perspective of color amongst these ancient Africans, The use of green and blue to represent the hair and skin of Egyptian deities should now become clear. These colours were simply derivatives being used purely as expressions of the broader black colour group. Worldhistory.org states, "Blue, or irtu, was the colour of the heavens, the dominion of the gods, as well as the colour of water. Blue was used for the hair of gods, specifically lapis lazuli, or the darkest of Egyptian blues, and for the face of the god Amun. Thus blue did not stand independent in the ancient world. It was a synonym of black. Blue and black were veritable iterations of the same expression of colour. This is similar to how we may view magenta, mauve and maroon all as iterations of red today. Interestingly, even as recently as the Middle Ages, dark-skinned black populations of Europe were referred to as blue men by the Norse. So, in short, the great black Osar was indeed black to the Egyptians. But now we have a logical explanation as to why he, like other gods and pharaohs, though being classified as black, could be depicted as blue, black or green on Egyptian reliefs.
Hail Osiris, stand up, rise up. Thy mother Nut gives thee birth. Thy two sisters make thee to journey. In thy name, Kemware, the great black one. So we have this sense of blackness being at the very heart and the essence at the beginning of things, right at the very beginning of the African development of their worldview.
This is pronounced Kam or Kem because we don't know what the vowel sound between the K and the M is. We don't have that vowel sound. Now, how you decide to translate that vowel sound really depends on the language that you actually choose to interpret ancient Kemetic. So it really depends which language you're using as a reference language to make these comparisons in terms of enunciation. Next, we have an owl gave us the sound M. Now, the first thing you've probably noticed already is that we already have an M in the first symbol. So there's two possibilities about the role that this owl in the word Kemet could play. The first possibility is that it's a phonetic complement. Now, what a phonetic complement is, was essentially a set of alphabetics or phonetics that were placed there to tell you how to pronounce a word. We can see this in the word Ankh, which was represented by this symbol by itself. Very commonly, when it was written in Medunetta, it was written as this Ankh with this symbol here, which gives us the N sound, and this symbol here, which gives us the back of the throat kind of K sound. So this essentially says Ankh, Ankh, but they're telling you how to sound out the word Ankh. So looking back at our word, they could be using this as a phonetic complement to tell you how to pronounce it. It could be there to tell you to emphasize the M. Alternatively, it could be there because they want you to sound out the M separately. So this word could say Kam, or they could say Kamem or Kamom. But for the sake of this example, we're just going to use the one M. So we have Kam here, and then next we have this little symbol here. We call it a loaf because that could cover both a cake and a piece of bread. This loaf here represents the sound T, or the T sound. So that gives us the word Kemet. Now you're probably wondering, well, if that's Kemet, what's this last thing? This last thing here is our determinative. Now remember I spoke earlier about determinatives and the fact they determine what a word is. And the symbol here is used to always reference a place where essentially people are dwellings. A town or a city is used frequently for nomes in the Medunetta, such as this hieroglyph here, which says Wasit, which is the city of Waset, or better known as Thebes. This one here, which says Abdu, which is Abydos. So we have lots of different examples of ancient Egyptian nomes and cities using this glyph, but they also used it for the entirety of their nation. So this is the part of Kemet that we occupy. This is the lived in parts. So that's probably a good way to think of it. Now, the key thing about determinatives is they're there to communicate to you what the word means, to put it into context for the sake of your understanding, for the sake of the language, but they're not there to be sounded out. So regardless of this symbol being here, it would still just be Kemet. So how do we translate this? Well, this simply just means black. And what is black? Black is the name of the city or the town. Now, interestingly enough, this is actually where we get the word alchemy from, because alchemy is an Arabic pronunciation of the land of Kemet, which is, al-Kemi, the Kemi, which in turn is where we get our practice of chemistry from, or the dark arts or the black arts, knowing that they originated in the land of ancient Egypt. So, now that we understand what the word Kemet means, it's at this point that we have to address the controversy, because the controversy arrives around whether or not Kemet meant black people or black land. Well, let's address the second claim first of all. Some people suggest that Kemet means black land or black soil, specifically the silt of the Nile. Now, do we have evidence that this is true or it's not true? And the answer is yes, we do. We have lots of evidence that this actually isn't true. One of the main reasons we know this isn't true is because if we look back at the use of determinatives. Now, if we want to signify that we're calling it black because of the soil, we could use a soil or earth determinative alongside the populus determinative. So you can combine determinatives when it's needed to convey something with a bit more clarity. You don't just have to use the single determinative. And you'll note, in this case, they haven't done that. So by simply omitting the earth determinative, which they had, or the arable land determinative, which you can see they also had, by simply omitting these two, we know for a fact that they weren't talking about the color of the soil. They were referring to something else. Now, have they been specific about what they were referring to? We're going to get into that shortly. However, we know from the omission of the earth, soil, land determinatives that they're not talking about the soil or the land. If you've enjoyed it, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't done that already. And if you want to support me on Patreon, I would love your support, because I do rely on it and I have a fantastic Patreon community, and I'm getting closer and closer to hopefully being able to do this full time. So if you believe in that vision with me, please do join me. But other than that, thank you very much for joining me on this